Hi, thank you for your interest in this timely topic of transgender inclusion in sport, recreation, and fitness. Please Google Sophia Neely, Trans Sports Illustrated, to view or download this research study in its entirety. It's free. I'm Sophia Neely. Annie Frank and I gave this presentation together in January 2021 at the National Association for Kinesiology in Higher Education conference, but the recording failed. So I am re-recording it solo, unfortunately without the great discussion we had with folks who attended the session. Playing adult recreational sports with transgender and non-binary teammates prompted my interest in this topic. I should probably mention a few definitions here, with the caveat that it is challenging to define complex phenomena with simple terminology. But in essence, cisgender people identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman, therefore I am cisgender, or cis. Transgender, or trans people, do not identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. They may identify as binary men, or women, or as non-binary. Non-binary folks do not identify exclusively as boys or men, girls, or women. They might identify with no gender, or all genders, and their gender identities might be fluid. It's important to note that gender identity is different from gender expression. My gender expression is somewhat masculine, though I identify strongly as a woman. You can't tell a person's gender identity by how they look or act. This is why it's important to ask people what pronouns to use for them. If strangers asked my pronouns before misgendering me as sir, I would feel less awkward in public places. In a 2006 qualitative study, Samerjan and Cohen specifically asked 4 trans participants how their athletic performance informed their gender identity and vice versa. I wanted to explore that connection more organically without explicitly leading participants to comment on it. I encourage you to read the comprehensive lit review in my dissertation. Did I mention it's a free download? Gender and even sex are more complicated than the gender binary would have us believe. Human beings develop gender identity based on inner feelings that they compare and contrast to socialized messages from people and external phenomena of what it means to be a man or a woman or any other gender. Despite increasing awareness and acceptance of trans people, especially among young adults, trans students still face significant challenges in schools. Alienation, refusal of school personnel to honor preferred names and pronouns, bathroom discrimination, bullying due to gender nonconformity, anxiety over gender-segregated activities, privileging of adults' views over children's, depression, low grades, loss of motivation, absenteeism. It's a long list. But a little support can go a long way toward helping trans students to cope with these substantial obstacles. Trans students who want to play sports face additional challenges. Opponents who seek to deny transgender student athletes the right to participate in school-based sports make 2 arguments. 1, it's not fair. 2, it's not safe or comfortable for others. Testosterone tends to factor into both arguments, but I discuss in my lit review that testosterone is a complicated hormone with complicated effects, and it is far from the only factor in athletic performance. So why is it often the only thing measured to decide whether or not to include trans people in competition? Athletic policies often include language intended to protect cis people and, quote, guarantee fair competition, which to me sounds like trans people are welcome to play as long as they don't win. As of May 2019, 17 states had athletic policies that trans advocate and athlete Chris Mosier deemed inclusive, but now trans athletes are facing legislative backlash in some states. Pictured from left to right here, Texas high school wrestler Mac Beggs, who was forced to wrestle against girls even though he wanted to compete against other boys. George Washington University's Kai Allams, whose women's basketball teammates accepted him as a man. Harvard University swimmer and trans activist Skylar Baylor. And non-binary swimmer on the University of Michigan women's team, G. Logan Ryan. Social science portraiture is an emerging methodology developed by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot that blends various qualitative approaches. Portraiture intentionally considers how participants, researchers, and audiences bring different dimensions of voice to the research process. This methodology enabled me to create detailed portraits that amplified voices of transgender folks whose identities are often misunderstood and invalidated. Data collection methods were a personal data sheet and 2 60-minute interviews with each participant. The first interview focused on their athletic identity and sports participation, and the second focused on their gender identity. Not surprisingly, all participants talked at length about both gender and sports in both interviews. At the end of the first interview, I asked a bridge question that became the focal point of the whole study. If you were featured on the cover of an inclusive Sports Illustrated magazine, what would that cover image look like? Then we revisited that question to open the second interview. This prompted rich dialogue that helped us to co-construct portraits of the participants' aspirational and authentic selves. These cover dialogues became the introductions to the study's findings, which featured each participant's individual portrait. Participants self-reported this information on the personal data sheet I sent them after receiving their signed consent forms to participate in the research study. As you can see, the small sample is diverse in terms of age, youngest 21, oldest 54, and race, black, white, and Asian American. Their primary sports interests are all different: baseball, CrossFit, powerlifting, rock climbing, and squash. And then for pronouns, zers feels most comfortable for Alex. The other 2 non-binary participants also go by gender-neutral pronouns. They're okay with, but not 100% comfortable with they-them pronouns. Ben and Will are trans men and use masculine pronouns. For sexual orientation, Dylan identifies as pansexual. They are attracted to people of various sexes and genders. Pansexual is one of many queer sexualities. The word queer can describe someone's gender identity or their sexual orientation, or both. I called the individual portraits sagas to highlight the participants' extremely compelling stories, but also as an acronym for sport and gender articulations. Kinesiologists in particular might appreciate the multiple meanings of articulation, not just the expression of the participants' athletic and gender identities, but also the anatomical articulation that enables them to perform sport-specific skills. I introduced each participant's saga with part of our dialogue about their imagined Sports Illustrated cover. Only Alex provided a photo of herself, but the other participants liked the images I found and altered to accompany their narratives. All consented to my including the images in the dissertation. The cover photo that Will imagined focused on core strength because it's important for success in squash. He said he'd have a smile or maybe a smirk on his face to show his playful personality and the confidence he is developing as his body starts to become more aligned with his gender identity. Now that he tends to be read as a man, though, he faces additional social challenges due to his race. Ben described his cover photo as doing a high box jump with his wife and 5 kids all around him, keeping him balanced, he said. He wanted to be pictured almost at the top of the jump, a great metaphor for the growth mindset that all of the participants possess. He gave birth to 2 children before his transition, so his kids call them their seahorse dad, because male seahorses give birth with eggs from females. An accomplished athlete, Ben is in his college's Athletic Hall of Fame for women's lacrosse and women's field hockey. I noticed that the college changed their record books to reflect his current name. It's important to validate trans people's identities by calling them by their chosen name, regardless of legal status or what your roster might say. Dylan described their gender identity by saying, quote, "I feel my gender is like if a question mark made a noise. That's where we're at." Dylan imagined an action shot for their magazine cover, doing a deadlift with a heavy barbell. They wanted the image to reflect hard work, fierceness, and edgy authenticity. In this image I created, you can see the angular question mark and imagine the weights rattling. Dylan wanted to be featured on the cover with other trans people, perhaps aspiring to feel a sense of belonging and camaraderie. When I asked Alex about gender, Z said, "No, gender just does not work for me. In their cover dialogue, we talk about this photo. Alex likes it because it doesn't give off as many gender cues as other photos of Zer, and because it clearly shows Z is on a baseball field, not softball. Kai, an Asian American non-binary rock climber, noted that their journey was much more profound than gender. They sometimes answer the question, "Are you a boy or a girl?" with, "Well, I'm everything. I'm all of these genders." Kai wanted to be pictured on the face of a cliff, using body tension to negotiate a sloped roof, one of the most difficult challenges in climbing. Kai loves climbing because it's an interesting 3D challenge, unlike basketball or track, the sports they played in high school, which are more vertical and horizontal. Embodied tension emerged from the data as the essence of being a transgender athlete. Participants embody and embrace tension to assert trans identities in opposition to restrictive gender binaries. Their gender sometimes clashes with their athletic participation. For example, when Ben and Alex had to switch to softball in high school instead of continuing to play baseball. Alex now plays on a recreational women's baseball team, though he is not a woman. Athletic and gender identity converge for these participants in surprising ways. I think this is the first study to find that skills and strategies useful in improving athletic performance parallel those used to develop and assert non-traditional gender identities. The trans athletes in this study embrace challenge. They don't have a fixed idea of their athletic abilities or their gender, but rather they draw on a growth mindset and other skills such as self-awareness, strength, and resilience to continuously learn in both domains. The strategies they employ for athletic and gender identity development include self-care and self-advocacy, picking their battles, and educating others, like helping teammates in athletics or helping cisgender people to understand trans identities. Consistent with the literature, this study found that trans people are often their own greatest advocate, and sometimes their only advocate. They must educate others not only to validate themselves, but also to build support networks. Dylan summarizes all participants' experiences in saying that correcting people who consistently misread or mislabel their gender is, quote, a big mental, emotional drain. I don't realize, I think, how much it takes a toll on me until I go somewhere where people flawlessly gender me correctly, end quote. It's also physically draining, which is one reason why self-care is so important. A big takeaway here is that a little support goes a long way. Based on this study's findings, trans people tend to appreciate any effort to use the pronouns and names that most accurately match their identities. It's okay to make mistakes. I slip up with pronouns all the time. Just please be aware that gendered language and practices are a source of continuous pain for trans and non-binary people. So just watching this video is a great step toward trans inclusion in sport, fitness, and physical education. So I thought I'd throw up a few questions here in case you're showing this in class or you want to talk these things. You can reach me at sophia.neely@gmail.com if you have any questions for me. Again, thanks for watching.